comes in, he's coming in with a lot of information.
And
yesterday was a heavy, heavy day.
It was crazy.
You saw that close-range police shot. I mean, Uliana.
Yeah.
I mean, what is this?
Trigger happy.
Is that what it is?
Officers.
The wild, wild west.
Crazy son.
Anarchy, like the one of the papers name it.
Na jamaa ako tu hapo kwa ukuta ametulia.
Yeah. Ajali.
Amekuja tu kujitafutia kipato cha siku.
Na amebeba nini?
Ule mwingine alikuwa amebeba
short gun. Irungu Houghton, he's executive director Amnesty International Kenya. Yeah. Karibu sana. Rough day yesterday.
Very long traumatic day for many people.
Goodness. Huh?
I think we've officially moved from concerns around authoritarianism to anarchy. And I think the Nation headline, the Standard headlines, they are all really taking us to a place where we have to take this now very seriously.
Yeah. And the fear, man. I mean, you'll be walking around and if you see a cop or someone who looks a cop, because, many of them are, our very uniform.
Yeah.
Sio, ukiona Subaru.
Unagwaya.
And the guy who was shot at close range, Chibaba, you were telling us?
Yeah.
Taken to hospital?
What's your take on that?
Did he make it?
No, unfortunately, he passed away roughly about 9:30, I think, at Kenyatta National Hospital. The circumstances, of course, are public in the sense that we all saw the footage and, just really traumatized by what I hope will be essentially a murder charge that will be filed against him. The police have spoken and they said that they will be brought to court. But I do hope that the Director of Public Prosecutions will charge them with murder.
Same thing they said about Aboutism, and here we are still struggling. It's just a mess, isn't it, Irungu? I mean, come on.
I think we started the week with concerns around the way that the Albert Ojwang investigation was being managed. And yesterday morning, the Police Reforms Working Group put out guidelines on how the police could manage the protests yesterday. But to be honest, I think they broke all of the 7 guidelines. We talked about de-escalating violence. We talked about the proportional use of force. We spoke about the importance of engaging and collaborating with the Independent Oversight Authority, where there were fatalities, but none of that happened yesterday. What we saw, and actually maybe a good place to start, is just a kind of roundup of the impact of the violence yesterday. So what we have been able to verify essentially is one person was shot. He was unarmed, and that was the vendor that
shot and killed.
I guess people were following that case very closely, but we had a medical team that had provided emergency medical support in the city the whole day. And the team came from the Kenya Medical Association. So they were medics that were voluntarily, none of them paid. Which in some ways also is a sharp contrast to any public health officers that were made available. I mean, one of the things we know about the protests, sadly, is that they always turn violent. Why we don't have Ministry of Health officials in the streets to essentially support not just protesters, but bystanders, counter-protesters, police officers. But it's really left to, non-government organizations to do this. And the Kenya Medical Association staff and the Red Cross basically followed up on the case of the young vendor, and unfortunately, he succumbed.
How many injuries?
So the number of injuries that have been confirmed are 25. 25 people were hospitalized, at least 5 with gunshot wounds by 9 p.m. last night. There is untold damage to public and private property across the city, and of course the city was a war zone yesterday. If you had landed in Kenya and you were at JKIA and you were watching the television screens as you came through the airport, you probably would have thought you've landed in Ukraine and Kiev or somewhere else. I mean, this is just shocking.
Or Haiti.
Or Haiti, actually, given the racial nature.
Yeah. Goodness. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better.
Well, I think the significance of what happened. So let's, in terms of human rights law, what happened yesterday was very significant. There's 2 things. One is, the states and national police services are the only agencies that have the authority and the means to exert force to protect law and order, to protect human property, human life and property, and therefore, they have a duty to protect. In the case of what we saw yesterday, there was absolutely no attempt to try and de-escalate the violence that we saw from the 300 instigators that were brought in to essentially target protesters.
We're talking about the goons, right?
The goons, has it ever happened before that the government sponsors goons to come and try to
disrupt
and peaceful protesters?
Yeah, it has happened before. I mean, we've had a number of cases. So, for example, if I go back to 2007, 2008, the use of militia protected by state agencies was partly responsible for the deaths of up to 1,000 people and hundreds of thousands of people displaced. In the 1990s, I worked with a number of organizations on what we used to call then ethnic clashes, but essentially what they were state-instigated clashes in the Rift Valley, essentially because of the reaction to the multi-party state. And there again, militias were mobilized, they were funded, they were unleashed, and they were protected by state officers, police officers. We know that from the national I guess the NCIC, that they have basically documented at least 25 criminal gangs that have been actively, supported or encouraged by politicians. And yesterday, what we saw was the Nairobi Central Business District become a playground, essentially, for people who were gathered. They were mobilized. They were gathered. They were put on the back of motorbikes, transported into the city. Many of them were talking about the money that they had received, and several of them walked past the Nairobi governor's office, paying tribute to the Nairobi governor.
Sakanya to protect Gigi.
Yeah, they were even using the county governor's symbol, which is the Tano Tena. So I think we have to be very careful. I think there are a number of things that can be done at the moment. I mean, I think the first thing is that we do need to see swift arrests. Yesterday, the National Police Service said that they have taken note of the gangs that were in the city. I thought that the sentence was very light, given that there were 6 hours of mayhem and destruction, and that they would carry out investigations. Last night, several human rights defenders, myself included, went to different police stations to see whether anybody had been arrested. We went to Kamkunji, we went to Central Police Station. There was no single arrest. Yesterday. Imagine that, the whole day, no single arrest. So I think if we look at it from the point of view of who has the responsibility to stop violence, it falls squarely on the state, and in particular the National Police Service. That did not happen.
And there's no initiative, there's no, this National Police Service is just, they're going from one misdeed to another.
What they did was actually bypass the police and unleash non-uniformed, non-commissioned elements to try and to stop the protests. And I think that's the bigger issue, because in the streets of Nairobi yesterday, many of us saw it. We could see police coordinating with the so-called goons and the gangs. And that's a very dangerous precedent, because it means that we no longer have one agency that's responsible for lives and property.
When we have now the government, it's like relinquishing this particular role or mandate to unauthorized personnel or elements, as you call them. What are we looking at in terms of our future when it comes to peace and prosperity for this nation?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that if we do not see a very sharp return to reason among the political class, among the executive, among the National Police Service, we are essentially fomenting a situation which may be very difficult to come back from.
Irungu, the other thing is, everybody knows about it. These goons will be released. Everybody's going to say the mother of all demonstrations is going to happen, not just in the nation's capital, but across the country. So, it's not going to be. It's not going to be good. It's going to be ugly.
This mayhem that we saw, the destruction we saw, only happened in one of the 4 counties in which there was protest yesterday. So we didn't see this in Mombasa. So I think the first thing we have to say is that what we saw yesterday must not be repeated. I think what you're referring to, which is a massive confrontation that we're expecting in the next week or so, that has to be interrupted at this point. The only way that can be done is essentially that the goons that were mobilized and unleashed, deployed, in fact, into the streets of Nairobi, that must not happen again. The Council of Governors must speak with the county government of Nairobi, and I should argue the members of the county assembly. There are members of the county assembly who very directly praised the goons yesterday, first thing in the morning and then towards the end of the day. So in a sense, the people that were unleashed with the full blessing of the political class of most of Nairobi. So we need to see the County Assembly of Nairobi challenge this slide to destruction. As somebody said, if you arrived at the airport, what would you do? I mean, is anybody going to board a flight to Nairobi? Is anybody going to invest in Nairobi? It's just a zero-sum game that has to be interrupted. The second thing is the National Police Service must look again at its deployment schedule. It must look again at how it responds and in some ways preempts the potential for violence. One of the things that has really struck me over the last 2 years, I mean, we're now into the third year of public protests. But in 2023, 2024, and this year, what we've seen is essentially the National Police Service not willing to engage with what I call the serial protesters. We know the protesters. Even children know who are the most active in terms of the Gen Z protesters. But it's somehow the National Police Service does not want to dialogue with them, does not want to create some rules of engagement that are consistent with Article 37.
Yeah. Shungo, who was indicating that people should stop provoking armed police. Not everyone has the ability, in terms of the police, to not choose force. Yeah. What's your take on that? Was that reckless, or did it hold any water?
I think it's completely misplaced. If it is a justification for the reckless and disproportionate and excessive use of force by police officers on protesters, it has no basis in law. And Kimani Ichung'wah he's a lawyer. He's also the leader of the majority. In that context, I think the statements do not take us to a place where we will see reduced violence. In a sense, what he's doing is essentially giving license to those officers, like the officer that shot the young vendor yesterday, who just seemed frustrated with his presence. I mean, it wasn't that the vendor was throwing stones, it wasn't that he was being violent, it wasn't that he was doing anything except trying to sell masks to people who were suffocating from tear gas. And he was shot at point blank range very viciously, and we all saw that. So I think, there is a time when, statements can actually accelerate violence, and statements can also reduce the violence. And I think what we need for the entire political class is to calm down and just focus on what is a proportional use of force in a context where we have civil strife.
And it doesn't end with Kimani Ichung'wah, because we also have Peter Kaluma saying, keep your crocodile tears to yourselves, indicating that before you mourn one of our own, who's Albert in this context, that we should start mourning all the other heroes or people who are taken out in the 60s when most of these young people were not born. Yeah. What's your take on that? Must we first mourn the Pintos?
Dead heroes,
yeah.
So psychiatrists refer to that kind of thinking as whataboutism, which is
whataboutism.
Yeah, it's actually it's a mental state, and what you do instead of dealing with the specific issue that is in front of you is that you just you take it to another level so that you don't have to deal with the issue that's there. So whataboutism is actually not a helpful way of thinking through this crisis that we're in. Secondly, I think the idea that this is somehow ethnic has to be rejected, because there was much in that statement that was to do with we the Luos. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping that the Gen Z population the kind of movement has taught us is that the greatest expression of our Kenyan identity is a national identity. It is not ethnic. And politicians that would like us take us back to a 1990s, 2000s framework just have to, style up and focus.
When he was putting that car in Homa Bay, driven all this way, 400 plus kilometers, and what happened in the car, we'll never know.
Yeah.
We'll never know. And then brought in Central Police and and ends up in Baghdadi, and he's half dead. And I mean, the torturing.
Yeah.
Has this police force gone rogue, or is it just a few elements?
If you think about it, over the last 2 years, we've had to change 2 inspector generals. This current inspector general is under a lot of public criticism, and I suspect also criticism from the political class.
Yeah.
Now, that's 3 inspector generals in 3 years, right? So I think we have to say that there is a cultural problem. The Interior Minister day before yesterday, spoke about the need for digital OBs, digital CCTV cameras in all the police stations. He gave a timeline within which that would happen. These are not unimportant things to do, but I think what is much more important in terms of the focus is essentially restoring a sense of accountability and a sense of professionalism with consequences for police officers and their commanders when they carry out actions that are unlawful or are serious crimes. And I think that's what we've not seen. So for the 89 people who were forcibly abducted and forcibly disappeared, for the 65 people who were killed over the last year or so, we have seen absolutely no accountability for that. And I think that essentially is what breeds this moment. When Rose Njeri was picked up and held for 88 hours, essentially just to intimidate her 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
The abuse of, the rights of a suspect essentially has breeded this moment. So I could go on like this, but I think what we saw with Albert Ojwang essentially was this impunity rear its head to a point where it's not that the police are acting on behalf of orders from above in terms of civilian authority or the executive, but in this case the police, it seems, took action because one of their own was in quotes defamed. But I do have hope for this court case, particularly if the public remains vigilant and we continue to put pressure. We would not have got this far if there had not been public attention to this issue. So I think the media, lawyers, human rights organizations, even citizens must continue to say that until we have justice for Albert Ojwang, we just do not have confidence in the National Police Service.
And then we're going to add onto that case with Eli Joshua or Boniface Karaoke's case again.
Yeah, I think this is now the latest case. So one of the things I've learned from the work with Amnesty is that every case has to be taken on its merit. It's difficult to go into a legal case with a sense of stereotypes, profiling, and some trends. Essentially, the evidence that is put in a court of law is what convicts people ultimately. The diligence of the prosecutors and the judicial officers is what produces a quick trial and a fair trial. So we must call for not just a quick trial, but also a fair trial to make sure that we actually have got the right people who killed Albert Ojwang, the ones who instructed them to do it, and the ones that knew that it was happening and somehow turned an eye. I think one of the things that Kenyans have become much more aware of is that people in command responsibility can do damage simply by looking the other way.
Yeah, the OCS at Central, is it Talam and others? I mean, that court case will drag and then people will move on to the next thing. Yeah. That's what we do. We just distract people and move on.
Well, I mean,
sadly.
56 million people have lives to live. I mean, I was really struck 2 days ago by somebody who said, why do we have to remember the names of people who have been brutalized by the state? Why is Rex Masai embedded in our consciousness now? Why is now Alfred Ojwang embedded in our consciousness? Why can't we remember, the names of innovators, industrialists, entrepreneurs, celebrities? Of course, we remember, but it's really struck me that actually there is a mass trauma that is now beginning to seep across the nation, and that mass trauma, unfortunately, it feeds violence, it fuels violence. They say hurt people, right? So I think we have to focus, on this, not just in terms of the specific cases, but in terms of what it's doing to the broad nation. Now, 56 million people cannot follow every case that has been, introduced in our courts. But that's why we have civic and human rights organizations. That's why, there is the independent medical legal unit that provides support for independent postmortems. That's why the Law Society of Kenya has a membership that will provide pro bono support for everybody. That's why the Kenya Medical Association will go to the streets even when there are bullets flying to treat people. That's why Amnesty continues to do this work. That's why the Kenya Human Rights Commission. Anyway, I could go on. One of the things that I think it's important to recognize at this time is that the independent offices and the constitutional commissions are being systematically defunded or are being taken over through selective appointments of their leadership. In particular, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights deserves our attention. You can't believe that with all that is happening, their budget this coming year, if nothing changes, will be 0.5 billion shillings. Now, 0.5 billion shillings is let me give you an example. So the national
That's 500 million.
It's 500 million, but it's the National Police Service receives 260 billion shillings. And the Kenya National Commission is getting the least of all of the independent offices and the Constitutional Commission, and it is a constitutional commission. So it is almost, it is very worrying for us that at a time like this, you are defunding the institutions that are keeping government accountable, and it seems to be a deliberate strategy. So I think we have to demand, as taxpayers, where we want our money to go. And that's another angle to this.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Irungu, are you worried about next week?
I am deeply worried. I think what we saw yesterday took it to another level. We've documented, we've monitored, we've supported court cases against officers that have undermined the Article 37, which is the right to assembly. We have urged protesters to remain non-violent, to remain structured, to have marshals, and to essentially give notification, because in doing that you give the police the capacity to be able to manage what might happen. But essentially what we saw yesterday was the beginnings of a trend that if we go that way, we are likely to see the kind of devastation we saw back in 2023 for those months of March to May. And I should mention that it's completely unnecessary in some ways. I mean, there is a logic to the violence. It's not that it's just happening, but there are people who are deliberately, intentionally fueling it and planning it, and they must be held accountable. But I think, I think back to the way that Governor Nyong'o managed the protests in Kisumu. Both in 2017, he began to find a different way from the kind of violence that claimed the life of Baby Pendo and various others. And that was primarily by bringing the law enforcement agencies together, the community human rights defenders together, and ensuring that there was a rapport between those bodies. And if you think about it, Kisumu has become much more, it was once the epicenter of this violence. So I think there are things that the county government of Nairobi can learn from the county government of Kisumu in terms of how do you protect law and order, how do you protect businesses, and how do you allow for people to just express their frustration with whatever it is that they're concerned about.
I know in this country the word resignation doesn't exist in any vocabulary or any dictionary. But would that help if the IG, if the deputy IG, if they resign, people in the top echelons, if they resign, would that help at all?
I mean, it's difficult to say at this point. I mean, the resignation of officers and the replacement with other officers that do exactly the same thing will just lead to further frustration and vexation. I think for Amnesty, one of the things we have been pushing for is change in the behavior of policing, all right? So, we must see the disbandment, for example, of the multi-agency unit that has been abducting people. We have to see the prosecution of officers who have essentially broken our laws to detain people incommunicado, to torture them, to intimidate them, to bring them to court in a very tortured state. I think we have to see those kind of actions take place, because that's what restores the reputation of the police and sends a signal to people that officers in uniform or out of uniform will be held accountable for their actions. At the moment, there is no sense of accountability. The statement that came from the Inspector General yesterday, I think if it was read by when it was read by the police officers, they don't feel a sense of obligation to stop what happened yesterday. There is no sense of consequences, and that's the danger. In fact, if anything, it seems to be there is more political mileage in continuing the kind of carnage that we saw yesterday. But obviously, for the officer that killed the vendor, he will face the law alone. It's not that he carries the entire police service there. None of the goons will be in court with him. That charge will be levied against him individually and potentially with the officer that was with him.